This paper is entitled Environmental Justice, Climate Catastrophe, and the Newark Water Crisis, and is presented by Melinda Gonzalez, postdoctoral associate for the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers University. Melinda Gonzalez is a tan-skinned woman with dark brown long hair wearing a houndstooth top and red lipstick. In 2015, Newark, New Jersey residents began to receive letters that the drinking water in the city's public schools had tested positive for lead contamination. Newark resident Jamila, who inherited her family home when her parents passed away, recalls, "I got this letter about the drinking water at Barringer High School, and somehow I was able to believe that the issue with the water in the schools was isolated to just the schools. That is, until I noticed that the water fountains in my doctor's office were closed too. Then in 2017, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection put out some information demanding that Newark officials needed to fix the water issue. That's when I realized that the problem was much larger than I had first considered." When shortly after Jamila got the water in her home tested, she learned that the water in her home was unsafe to drink. She wondered if the high levels of lead in her family home were responsible for the multiple illnesses her parents suffered, leaving her without living parents before the age of 30. This concern prompted Jamila to organize for clean water and raise awareness on the issue with other activists in Newark. The notion that Newark's tap water was not safe for consumption and was making people sick was pervasive when I was a child. As early as the 1980s, when I was growing up in Newark, my mother would buy bottled water for drinking and cooking. Thus, it was little surprise to me as a disaster researcher when in 2016 it was reported that there were record high levels of lead in the drinking water. Instead of rushing to fix the water crisis immediately, Newark officials assured residents that the lead contamination was isolated to particular areas of the city, as seen in this 2018 water quality report signed by Newark Mayor Ross Baraka. Failure to act adequately throughout the entire city by Newark officials and the New Jersey government would mirror a story too often heard in predominantly Black cities like Flint, Michigan, and Washington, D.C. The city was legally mandated to provide bottled water and filters to all affected Newark residents when lead levels at several sites were reported to be 47 parts per billion. This is 3 times the federal EPA guideline, which states that lead levels should be below 15 parts per billion. In June 2018, 2 years after the crisis had been publicly announced, the Newark Education Workers Caucus and the Natural Resource Defense Council filed a citizen suit against the city of Newark and New Jersey state officials demanding a solution. Still, by 2019, it was reported that Newark's lead levels were some of the highest in any major city in the United States at 57 parts per billion. When the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic halted the world, it also forced Newark residents into a lockdown with restrictive curfews. COVID-19 posed the risk of contracting a highly infectious respiratory virus, but it also increased exposure to lead contaminant water as Newark residents struggled to access bottled drinking water due to shortages, leaving them to drink from the tap. As if the lead crisis is not enough in Newark, New Jersey, it is also home to 4 of New Jersey's 114 Superfund sites. And Essex County is home to numerous environmental pollutants due to large industrial areas and airport and mass highway traffic. One of the Superfund sites in the Ironbound section of Newark used to be a chemical plant which contains uncontrolled toxic waste. Multiple counties in New Jersey ranked 12th worst in the nation for ozone pollution, and the Passaic River, which feeds into the Newark Bay, has large amounts of dioxin, mercury, PCBs, and other toxic contaminants. Thus, it is no surprise to learn that many of the almost 300,000 residents of Newark suffer from numerous ailments connected to environmental contamination. For example, 1 in every 4 children in Newark has asthma. This is 3 times higher than the national average. Add the fact that 86.4% of Newark residents are Black and Latinx, 28.2% live below poverty, with 19% lacking health insurance, and the disaster situation becomes ever more apparent. In our interview, Jamila continued, quote, "When we speak to people about the lead crisis, they have this feeling of, well, of course. There's almost this list of attributes for any, quote, ghetto or, quote, project where we have just come to accept that the school system is not up to par and the water is not up to par. When another terrible ingredient gets added up, there's a sense of pride for coping with the fucked upness of it all. Someone said to me, I'm worried about getting shot out here, and you're talking about lead in the water? When people are worried about potholes and murderers, contaminated water falls so low in the long list of grievances that folks have. And I'm here trying to tell them that this is all interconnected." End quote. The interconnectedness of street violence, illness, aggression, and the exhaustion of having to be resilient may also be linked to years, if not decades, of drinking lead contaminant water and being exposed to numerous environmental contaminants. Jamila and other Newark activists want to know why nearly a quarter of Newark residents have at some time either been incarcerated or had significant involvement with the criminal justice system. Could environmental contamination be part of the problem? For the time being, let's just focus on the impacts of lead contamination. Lead is a potent neurotoxin that impacts every organ in the human body and especially targets the central nervous system and developing brain, leading to psychoneurological disorders and increased potentiality for higher aggressivity. In children, lead contamination is associated with behavioral and learning problems, lower IQ and hyperactivity, slowed growth, hearing problems, and anemia. New Jersey law requires pediatricians to order testing of blood lead levels, BLLs, of all children at both 12 and 24 months of age, or at age 6 for all children not tested when younger. In 2016, 4.7% of children under age 6 in Newark had elevated blood levels, twice as much as the rest of the state. 7.1% of Newark's children ages 6 to 26 months had BLLs of 5 micrograms per deciliter or higher, with 5.9% at over 10 micrograms. Taken from CDC guidelines, 5 micrograms is the number New Jersey has chosen as an indicator of high levels of lead. Yet, over 24% of children under age 6 tested as having 3 to 4 micrograms. In adults, lead contamination can cause cardiovascular effects, such as increased blood pressure and incidence of hypertension, decreased kidney function, memory loss, mood disorders, weakness, body pains, frequent headaches, and reproductive problems in both men and women. For adults, testing for lead contamination is significantly less common than it is for children, with the most common being a ZPP test. However, one can ascertain that the numbers for adults, Newark residents, either mirror those of children or are significantly higher due to decades of exposure. Once in the body, lead gets stored in the bones. Harm caused by this toxic metal is irreversible. It is clear from the science and health consequences that there is no safe level of lead exposure, not for children or adults. This paper comes from a larger project focused on racial and class disparities in the ongoing lead-contaminated drinking water crisis and seasonal floods occurring in Essex County, New Jersey. Through interdisciplinary work rooted in environmental anthropology, this project lived through This project addresses the intersections of climate catastrophe and environmental contamination as they are lived through and embodied by Black and Latinx New Jersey residents. Based on ethnographic work with the Newark Water Coalition and other water rights groups, I pay particular attention to how cities that have been racialized as Black and Latinx experience environmental and medical racism. Further, in the larger project, I examine how gentrification and displacement in Black and Latinx cities influences local government action and inaction on environmental, medical, and water crisis. Tracing how state and local actors' responses shift alongside changes in the city's racial demographics. This work will contribute to scholarship on gentrification and how it intersects with ongoing environmental and medical crises. In this paper, I focus on the experiences of two activists advocating for clean water in Newark to highlight the multiple layers of dispossession and environmental contamination that Newark residents experience. In Newark and surrounding areas, we are dealing with environmental classism and environmental genocide, explains David. A lifelong activist of movements against police brutality and for housing rights, David started to advocate for water issues in 2018. Newark officials had started handing out water filters to Newark residents by 2018, but in mid-2019, reports came out that 2/3 of the filters were failing and are being used improperly. Around this time, the Video Music Awards were hosted in Newark, and activists took this as an opportunity to raise national attention on the water crisis. This event, I am told, was also the real birth of the Newark Water Coalition. The Newark Water Coalition was started by two residents, Saber Burrows and Anthony Diaz. The two activists gathered with 30 community members weekly to distribute water at local churches. By early 2020, they were providing water to over 200 families a week, and then the COVID-19 pandemic brought their distribution to a near total halt. In conversation with Diaz and Burrows, they explained that their water distributions heavily relied on supermarket and local donations, but supermarket sanctions meant that they could not buy water to distribute to the community. Further, it was prohibited for people to meet up in groups of 5 or more. Prompted by this inability to assist the community through their usual channels, community collaborator Catherine Ramos coordinated with 501c3 founders Jaden Smith and Drew Fitzgerald to get assistance through their water box program. The Newark Water Coalition received their first water box in August 2020, but struggled to stay at one of their water distribution sites due to their politics, particularly their call to abolish the police as a stance against police brutality. While the water boxes have gone a long way to help local residents and prevent the use of 80,000 individual water bottles, the coalition faces numerous challenges to provide adequate support to the community. Diaz informed me that, quote, people want bottled water, especially Poland Spring, unquote. And moreover, water is just one of the issues they are dealing with. Newark residents face food and housing insecurity, worsened by pandemic evictions and unemployment. One of the challenges activists face with mobilizing community support is also the fact that environmental contamination is not an instant killer. So the immediacy of contamination is pushed back to deal with more immediate needs like food, shelter, and safer streets. To address these issues as well, the Newark Water Coalition has put together numerous community refrigerators that have provided about 20,000 pounds of food. These food distribution sites also serve as locations for recruitment and the dissemination of information. I always tell people that if they are not sure if their water is contaminated, they need to test the water, explained Diaz during our chat. The only way to know is to test it. Residents have high level of distrust due to years of conflicting information from city and state officials that have contradicted the work activists are doing to raise awareness on the dangers of lead contamination. Feelings of distrust are compounded by the fact that as of August 2021, headlines proclaim that the Newark water crisis is over after over 20,000 lead-based service lines were replaced. Yet in October 2021, pipes were still being replaced in many Newark neighborhoods. Diaz asserted in our interview that the water crisis in Newark is about more than just replacing the pipes. Just this fall, two major rainstorms, including remnants from the Hurricane Ida, left large parts of Essex County submerged in water. Numerous basements were flooded as sewage pipes overflowed and receded into freshwater sources. How can city officials claim that to have ended the crisis? What about the contaminated water in the Newark Bay? What about annual flooding and worsening climate catastrophe that has caused the deaths of New Jersey residents? Moreover, what about the lives, health, and well being of all those who have been impacted by lead exposure? Replacing the pipes is not enough. It's an important start, but the water crisis is far from over. Thank you.